Shalom, everyone, and welcome to Coffee and Connection Week 51. So happy to be back here with all of you. I really appreciated last week everyone's not just understanding, but I got a lot of love and nice messages. And I thank you all for your concern. And just like it helped me feel really connected to all of you. So even if we didn't get to have coffee and connection, I got to feel very connected to many of you amazing women. It's so amazing to be a part of this community. Thank you all for connecting here. And even though I didn't get to come on Coffee and Connection, I did, thank God, get to spend some of the time working on my exciting project. I'm really excited about what's coming up in January. And I know I got to send out that email, and thank you to everyone who filled out the survey. If you'd still like to fill out the survey, and if you'd still like to save that date on your calendar, go ahead and click on that email from last week. And you know what I'm really speaking to in that email, and what are the events that I'm so excited about, the Absolutely Intimate event. I believe it's January 17th. What we're going to be really speaking into is this topic that keeps coming up over and over again. Anytime I ask women, what's the biggest issue in your relationship, or what's causing the biggest struggle? What are your questions? Even when I send out for questions for Coffee and Connection, what I hear so often and just over and over again is this issue of, we're so different. This issue of differences. And very often when we're talking about differences, we kind of get to this place where we feel like, the only way that the relationship can be the way we want it, the only way I can have the life I want to live, the relationship I want to have, the home that I want to have, the only way that can happen, it seems, is if either I get him to change, right? If he, why can't he just get to be more like me? How can I make him change? How can I get him to see why he has to be a certain way, right? It's either get him to change, make him change, or the other option seems to be I have to change. I have to fit myself into what will work for him or what will work for the relationship. I have to be somebody else that can deal with these differences. And that thought of having to change, or the idea of getting somebody else to change, is very frustrating, right? It causes a lot of resentment. It causes a lot of pain, because the truth is, besides, what we've discussed, where we can't get someone to change. And the truth is that, do we even want to change? Should we even change? Like, we are who we are and who we are married to. Both of those, like, the reason we're in a relationship together is because we chose each other, right? We chose each other. I chose him and he chose me. And the underlying issue, right? Like I said, even if, besides the fact that, like, can we actually do it? Can we change ourselves? Can we change our husbands? Besides for the fact that that doesn't really work for so many reasons, the reality is that that doesn't even like feel good. It feels so painful to think, because that would mean that we're not good enough. It either means that I'm not good enough, or it means that I'm giving the message to the person I'm married to that they're not good enough. And we know that in order to feel safe, in order to have a good relationship, in order to have real connection and intimacy, each person has to feel safe and accepted the way they are. So, like, what is this thing about feeling we need to change, and what can we do about it, and what do we do, and like, what do we try to do? That's what we're going to be talking about and diving into for the next few weeks, because it's such an important topic, and it causes so much pain and so much frustration in so many of our lives, right? And we all think we're the only ones, right? We all think we're the only one who thinks we have to change, or we're the only ones who needs our husband to change, or we're the only one dealing with these huge differences. And I think we've talked about it, but I'll mention it here that a lot of times I think that's set up even just in the way that we date, the way we get ready for marriage. We somehow convince ourselves that if we date properly, we're going to find a guy and he's going to find the woman who's just like us, right? We're going to find someone who's exactly like us and we're going to live happily ever after, right? And we think when we get married, we often really believe that, oh my gosh, like, yeah, if I dated properly, then I found a guy who's just like me, right? And so when the differences start to creep up, not only are they shocking, right? Like, what? I can't believe we have these differences. I can't believe we don't agree on this. I can't believe we're so different. Not only are we shocked because, hey, the way when we dated, we, seem to be so the same. Not only that, but we can take it in so many different ways to mean that we somehow failed or our relationship is going to fail, because how did we end up? How did we make the mistake of ending up with someone who's so different from us? We must have made a mistake. We must have married the wrong person. And what I'd really is so important, what I really want to like allow us to really understand together is to really get to that recognition of understanding. You ready? Of course we're different. Of course we're different. We're two different people. Different sexes, different upbringings, just different people with different personalities. So when those differences happen, we don't have to be shocked. And it doesn't have to mean that there's anything wrong with either of us, right? That's the very first thing. I want you all to just feel so normal. Like you're normal that you feel, I wish my husband was different than me, right? I can't believe we have these differences. And I don't mean to mitigate them. I mean, we're talking, I totally get like years and years of frustration and pain of like, why are we so different? And what's different? How could we deal with these differences without realizing that, like, of course we're going to be different. Of course we're going to have differences. And that doesn't make anything about us wrong. But then the question still remains, right? What are we going to do about that? Do we have to just suffer with them? I'm here to tell you that you don't need to suffer through your differences. You don't need to just like grin and bear it. You don't need to change, and you don't need to make him change. It doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your relationship that you're different, but it also doesn't have to mean that your relationship is suffering because you're different. It is possible to deal with those differences. It is possible to live together in an absolutely intimate relationship with those differences. And what I'd like to talk about today, besides, this normal piece is always so important, and to give you that hope, because it is so important to also believe that it is possible to have connection in your differences, to have connection with the differences. I don't want to say even though you're different, because of course you're different, right? And what do we do instead? So just so that in case you somehow, in case you're like thinking, well, I don't know if I really deal with this issue, or I really want to go into different things that we do, or let's even start like this. What happens when we start to see those differences? And we were just talking about this today in our mastery call. It's so important to understand that the differences that we see in ourselves, right? The differences that come up in how we want our relationship to be, or who we want our husbands to be, or even who we want to be with them. The difference between that and what we actually experience in our relationship is what Terrence Real calls the oh, now it just escaped me. He calls it oh my gosh, what does he call it? He calls it, oh my gosh, look, the difference. He calls it something, the gap. I think he calls it the gap. Okay, whatever. He calls it the gap, right? That big gap between what you want, right? Your expectations, your vision, what you believe it's supposed to be like, right? And then what actually is, it's that space, it's within that space that all of our frustration is lying, right? And that's where we start to when we try to close that gap, right? That we often use certain techniques, which, as you'll hear, are all about trying to make change happen, to force change, to force the other person usually to change. Okay. So, what do we do when we're feeling that gap? What do we do when we feel like, oh my gosh, this isn't what I wanted? This isn't what I expected, or the dreaded, this isn't what it should be, right? When life doesn't meet up to our expectations. So, he describes 5 different things that people do when they're dealing with that difference. Okay. And let's just go through them quickly because they're so important to recognize and be able to look at it and be like, you know what? Maybe I do that, or sometimes I do that, to realize that when we're coming from that place, to realize, oh, I'm trying to force change. And then we can start to talk about from next week, what we can do instead, right? Because trying to force change, as we said, if we're trying to change, make ourselves change, or trying to force him to change, that is going to only lead to that frustration and resentment and pain and feeling of like not good enough, and it degrades and lowers, like it totally compromises the safety that is necessary for connection. So you may in the end get him to change, right? Or you may make yourself change to make him happy, but then you lost the safety. So what kind of intimacy are you really creating? What kind of connection is there really going to be, right? So let's talk about those 5 things. The first thing he mentions is that he calls it unbridled, brittled, I think is the word, or just like total self, like I'm just going to express how I feel, right? I'm just going to totally let you have it and let you know exactly how I feel, right? And we're not talking here about not communicating. We'll get to communication. But what the first thing to recognize is when we're saying, I need to let it all out so you can see the full fury of how I feel, and maybe I want you to scare you into changing. Maybe I want you to feel guilty into changing, right? When we're just like, we let it all out in a way that is just not safe and is not thinking about how it feels for the other person. Usually in this state, we're so bothered, we're in so much fear by this gap that we're just spewing it all out. But sometimes we actually justify it in our mind of like, I have to tell you how I feel. I have to make sure you realize how horrible you are for being different from me, right? So that's the first thing to be aware of. Like, how are we expressing the differences that we're feeling to our husband, right? Are we expressing it in a way that's safe? Or are we just giving ourselves permission to let it all out? And you usually can know if you're in that one if afterwards you don't necessarily feel any better, right? You express everything that you're feeling, but you actually feel worse than you felt before. Because, yeah, you let the person have it, and now you're like, and now I feel like garbage, right? Because that's not who I want to be. And the other person probably can't even really hear you because, nobody can hear anyone when they're, in such a state. So that's the first one, right? Unbridled self expression. Another one is that we try to control, we try to get the person to do what we want them to do, to be who we want them to be. We try to manipulate, we try to make them act the way that we want them to act. And this one is really common and very dangerous, right? Because it totally erodes on that safety, erodes respect in the relationship and trust. And it also is really damaging and the healthy boundaries that we need in a relationship, right? When any one person thinks that they can tell another person how to act or who to be, when we try to manipulate people into being a certain way, it really, when we're like, well, I just need to get you to do a certain thing, and I'm going to tell you what you should be doing or guilt you in any way, right? So we're really also like eroding on that safety. Another one that we do is we retaliate, right? We try to hurt the other person. Sometimes part of that retaliation can be what's called hurting from the victim position, right? Where it's you make yourself into the victim, so you hurt the other person back as if you are the victim, right? Degrading them, or thinking you can just yell at them, or act in it's okay, it's justifiable for me to treat you bad because I'm the victim here, right? Really, if you think about it, anytime anyone's playing the victim, it becomes like a race to see who's the bigger victim, right? That's what a lot of fights are about. So we have retaliation. We have totally shutting down, right? Where we just shut down. We don't engage in the relationship because we feel like, well, we're so different. What's the point, right? What's even the point of engaging in this relationship where we're so different? I'm just going to give up. And that's also really it's really damaging to the relationship. Uh-oh. It's really damaging to the relationship because it means that there's no ability to actually try to create connection, right? You really lose that ability to connect with each other. And the last one, which I think a lot of us can relate to, is when we get into like a race to see, not necessarily a race, but a competition to see who's right, where everything becomes about, well, who's right and who's wrong, right? Like, like anytime you're like, well, you said this and then I did that. No, I said this and then you did that, right? And you're always trying to like prove like why you're right and why what you did was justified, and exactly what is it that happened, all that nitpicking, right? You said this. No, I said that. No, I said that. No, first this happened. No, right? All of that is about trying to like prove who's right. And as Stephen Covey always says, right? If one of you's right, that means the other one's wrong, right? So who wants to be in a relationship with the wrong person, with the person who's wrong, right? If you're always right, then your husband's always wrong. And if your husband's always right, then you're always wrong. And that sucks. Nobody wants to be in either of those kinds of relationships, right? So those are the kinds of things, those kinds of actions, those kinds of behavior. If anyone wants some accountability here, you're welcome to put into the chat like the name of the one that you mostly, you see mostly in yourself, or you can recognize as being in your relationship, right? Which one do you use, right? What's your like MO when you feel that there's a difference, that there's a discrepancy, that your husband is not being the guy that you want him to be, right? Or that you feel that he wants you to be somebody that you're not, right? Those kinds of things we want to start to recognize when we're falling into that trap, because then all the things that we're going to discuss that you can do when you're in a state of feeling different from each other, you can start to recognize, oh, instead of, trying to be right, I can shift into the tools that actually work and allow me to actually create connection and intimacy and a feeling of partnership, even though we are different. right? So we talked about a lot of different things today, but what I really want to really make, like, just be so clear on and really invite you all to engage in this journey on with me is this idea of recognizing that yes, most of our frustrations in marriage are coming from the fact that we are different, is coming from the fact that we have differences. And no, that doesn't mean that we married the wrong guy. It doesn't mean that we were stupid when we were dating. It doesn't mean that we made a mistake. It means we're human beings, two different, healthy human beings. And therefore, we're going to be different from each other. And yes, there are frustrations that come with the fact that we're two different people, right? That's what marriage is. That's why it brings out so much great stuff, right? We get to all work together on ourselves because, we're dealing with these relationships, but that it doesn't have to mean anything. It doesn't mean anything bad. It means learning a set of tools, learning skills to be able to deal and connect in those differences. Not only do those differences not have to disconnect us, those differences can actually become the source of our connection. It becomes the way that we create real intimacy because we're connecting as two different people, right? And so we also discussed the different things that you can start to recognize, the different ways that you can like recognize what are your patterns, how do you act when you're feeling those differences so that you can, look to then know when you're in those patterns. And as we discuss new tools, you can look to shift out of those patterns into ways that will actually not cause disconnect, but cause connection and intimacy. And I think my son is awake and I don't know why. But here, I wanted to thank you all for coming here. I don't even get to drink my coffee. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol nהיה bidbaro. Yummy decaf coffee that I have special for Coffee and Connection. So excited to be back here with all of you. So excited to see you again next week. There's so much on this topic that I'm excited to spend an extended amount of time. We'll have 2 more Coffee and Connections. We'll have this event. I'm really excited to connect with all of you. If you haven't filled out the survey, please go ahead and do so because it'll just be great to have your input and make sure that I put everything in there that I can so I really answer all of your questions. And until next time, may we all be blessed to live, love, and be loved with all our hearts. Goodbye for now.